A father drags his daughter to be sold like livestock, claiming she's deaf. The Duke who buys her doesn't know that silence hides an extraordinary gift until it's too late. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. And trust me, you won't want to miss tomorrow's story, so stay tuned. The crisp autumn air hung heavy with the scent of damp leaves and the earthy tang of livestock. The small village of Ashford, nestled in the rolling hills of Victorian England, bustled with its customary market day energy. Traders hawked their goods, fabrics, spices, and fresh produce, while farmers bargained over cattle and horses. Lord Henry Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had no particular interest in the day's events. He preferred the peace and solitude of his vast estate, where the only disturbances were the occasional calls of birds or the rustling of leaves in the wind. Dressed in a long dark coat and a tall top hat, Henry surveyed the scene from the edges of the crowd. His face was impassive, his sharp features betraying no emotion. He had attended the auction out of habit more than necessity. As the Duke of Ashford, he was expected to make an appearance, though he rarely engaged with the townsfolk. His wealth and title made him a man apart, a figure that others admired from a distance but never truly approached. The sound of horses' hooves and cattle lowing filled the air as Henry made his way down the narrow lane toward the corral. He barely glanced at the horses being sold, his thoughts elsewhere. But then, something caught his eye. At the far edge of the auction grounds, behind a group of cattle, stood a girl. She was young, no older than 16, with long brown hair tangled with dust, her face hidden beneath a grimy shawl. Her dress was tattered at the hem, her bare feet calloused and dirty from the long hours spent standing in the market. The girl did not cry out like the other auctioned goods. She did not beg for attention or sway her head in hopes of drawing a bidder's eye. Instead, she stood motionless, her head slightly tilted, her eyes downcast, as if she were resigned to her fate. Henry's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended. There was something strange about her stillness. Amidst the noise and chaos of the auction, she was an island of calm. And yet, there was something unsettling in her silence. Her lack of movement wasn't that of a simple, passive observer. There was a quiet strength to her that caught Henry's attention. A loud voice broke through his musings. "This one here, a fine mare and a worthless girl to go with it." The drunken voice slurred. Henry's gaze shifted to the man standing beside her, a disheveled man, his face flushed with the effects of too much drink. He was waving a bottle in one hand and holding a rope in the other, which was tied around the girl's wrist. The rope was tight, pulling her hand, making her shoulders tremble slightly under the strain. The man's words carried through the crowd as he haggled with a prospective buyer. "Got this one from my first wife," the man continued, his words garbled. "She don't talk, don't hear, neither. Just sits there like a dummy. Don't need feeding, don't need nothing, but she'll clean and cook, won't complain about a thing. Take her off my hands. Cheap." The crowd laughed, a few men snickered darkly, and one spat on the ground. Henry felt a knot tighten in his chest. It was a familiar cruelty, the type of scorn that had been directed at the weak and vulnerable for centuries, but it had always grated on him. There was something particularly egregious about it now. This girl, this silent figure, was being sold like livestock, her life reduced to a few cruel words. The insult to her dignity burned in Henry's gut. Henry made a move to turn away, but as he did, the girl's gaze caught his. Her eyes locked onto his with a calm intensity that felt like a jolt of cold air. No desperation, no pleading, just a look so steady, so quiet, that it held him in place. There was something in her eyes, something that mirrored his own isolation. Henry froze, unable to look away. The girl's silent scrutiny felt like an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. In her unspoken gaze, there was an understanding, a recognition of something he couldn't name. It was not pity nor fear, but a mutual silence between two souls who had been unseen for too long. The drunken man stumbled toward him, unaware of the silent exchange between his daughter and the Duke. "You want the horse?" he asked in a rasping voice. "Take the girl too, for the same price. Ain't worth the dust on her toes." Henry's mouth went dry. His instinct screamed to walk away, to continue his business and leave the girl to whatever fate awaited her. But as he stood there, transfixed by her gaze, something in him shifted. His heart, long closed off from others, seemed to open just enough to allow room for pity, or was it something deeper? He couldn't tell. The man laughed, unaware of Henry's internal struggle. "You buying livestock, or are you starting a new venture?" one of the onlookers jeered. Henry's eyes snapped to the man, his expression hardening. The laughter around him faded into the background as his thoughts crystallized. He knew this was madness, a rash decision, but in that moment, all he could see was the girl silent, still, yet full of strength. He looked at the man, who still held the rope with one hand, the other swinging the bottle carelessly. "I'll take both," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment. The man blinked in confusion before a slow grin spread across his face. "You're mad, you know that? But you've got the coin for it. Take her." Henry counted out the coins, paying a fair price for the horse and what was now a burden he wasn't sure he fully understood. The man took the money without a word and handed him the rope. He looked at Clara, who hadn't moved, hadn't even reacted to the transaction. She simply stood there, her eyes still fixed on Henry. With a gentle motion, Henry untied the rope from her wrist, tossing it back at the man. Clara flinched at the sudden movement, but she didn't step away. Instead, she took a tentative step forward, as if testing whether or not she was truly free. Henry gestured for her to follow him. She did so silently, her feet soft against the earth, her every step deliberate but graceful. She did not speak, nor did she ask for anything. She simply followed, her eyes watching the ground ahead of her, as though it was the only thing that mattered. As they walked toward his carriage, Henry felt the weight of her presence, the quiet strength she carried with her. She had nothing, yet in her silence there was more than the world could understand. When they reached the carriage, she stopped and waited, a patient stillness hanging between them. Without a word, Henry opened the door for her. She stepped inside, folding herself into the corner like someone accustomed to being invisible. Henry closed the door gently behind her, his fingers brushing against her sleeve as he did. A faint, unexpected tug on his coat made him look down. Clara's small, calloused fingers had brushed against his sleeve for just a moment, as though she had meant to reach out but hesitated. He could feel it then, the weight of her trust. She hadn't thanked him, she hadn't begged, but in that brief touch, she had chosen him. In that moment, Henry Ashford, who had spent his life surrounded by silence and solitude, understood that his life would never be the same. He had bought a girl, yes, but what he was starting to realize was that he had bought something far more profound than he could have ever imagined. The carriage rumbled to life, and the wheels creaked over the cobblestone road as they made their way back to Ashford Manor. Behind him, Clara sat curled beneath the blanket, her face turned toward the window, her gaze lost in the endless horizon. Henry didn't speak to her, nor did he feel the need to. For the first time in years, he found comfort in the silence. As the estate came into view, Henry's thoughts were far from the horse he had purchased or the girl who sat silently beside him. Instead, he thought about the unspoken connection they had shared in that brief moment at the auction. Clara had seen him, understood him, without a single word, and for the first time, Henry felt a sense of something he had long lost hope. Clara, the silent girl with the silent eyes, had chosen him in a way no one ever had, and perhaps, in the quietest moments, he would find that she could teach him more than he ever knew was possible. The Duke of Ashford's life, which had once been marked by an overwhelming stillness, had now become a world of unexpected, profound change. The vast expanse of Ashford Manor stretched before Clara, a place so grand it seemed to stretch endlessly. As the carriage rolled through the wrought-iron gates and along the long, winding gravel driveway, Clara caught glimpses of the mansion's imposing silhouette, its towering windows, delicate stonework, and the sprawling gardens that surrounded it. The estate was a world apart from the life she had left behind. It was a world of wealth, of grandeur, of silence, a silence far different from the one she had known. Inside the grand estate, Clara was led to a room on the second floor, far from the bustling parts of the house. The servants, who had been instructed to show her to her quarters, did so with a quiet efficiency, though they eyed her with curiosity. They were not unkind, but their gaze was filled with the unspoken question of why the Duke had brought this girl into his home. Despite the pity, the whispers, and the hushed words from the staff, Clara never flinched. There was a quiet strength in her, a quiet dignity that belied her situation. The room assigned to her was large, with tall windows that overlooked the sprawling gardens outside. The heavy curtains were drawn back to allow the fading sunlight to spill into the space, filling the room with a soft, golden glow. The bed, covered in rich silks, was large enough for two, but Clara had no need to rush into its comfort. She stepped into the room and simply stood still for a long moment, her feet planted firmly on the floor as if she were rooted to the earth. Everything about this place was different, the luxury, the quiet, the expanse of space, but Clara did not seem overwhelmed. She observed it all, absorbing it in the same way she had always observed the world. As the servants left her to settle in, Clara's fingers traced the edges of the furniture, soft, delicate carvings in the wood. Her eyes flickered from the armoire to the ornate fireplace, noting the details with the same precision she used when studying the world outside. There was no fear in her actions. She did not hesitate, as if she had always known the rhythm of such spaces. It was as if she belonged here, despite the strangeness of it all. Henry stood just outside the door, watching the girl through the crack in the threshold. He had given the orders for her to be left alone, but something within him, some nagging curiosity, urged him to watch. He had seen her quiet resilience at the auction, her silent, unspoken strength as she had followed him out of that crowd. And now, in this vast home that he had built for himself, a place that had always been empty in more ways than one, he found that Clara's silence seemed to fill the rooms in ways he never expected. Henry's thoughts drifted as he leaned against the doorframe. The life he had known had always been solitary. The grandeur of his title, the vastness of the estate, the servants who catered to his every need, they all kept him apart from others. His social interactions were few, and the loneliness he had grown accustomed to had carved a deep emptiness in his soul. He never expected a day would come when another person might fill that void, let alone a girl who appeared to have no voice of her own. He had bought her out of pity, out of a strange sense of moral obligation, but now, seeing her in this opulent room, surrounded by comfort and wealth, he couldn't help but wonder what exactly he had brought into his life. Henry's fingers lingered on the door handle, and for a moment he considered stepping into the room. But he hesitated. The girl, Clara, had not asked for this life. He could not imagine the kind of hardship that had led her here, nor the kind of pain she had endured. And yet, she seemed unbroken by it. She moved with a calm assurance, as though she had always belonged in a world of fine things, even though she had never spoken a word. It was perplexing. He had expected to see fear, uncertainty, perhaps a deep longing for something more. Instead, he saw only an eerie composure that unsettled him. Clara turned toward the window and gazed outside, her eyes fixated on the garden. Her posture was relaxed, but her face held an expression that seemed to be searching for something, or perhaps recalling something. She did not look back at Henry, nor did she give any indication that she was aware of his presence at the door. And yet, Henry could not shake the feeling that she had sensed him there, that she knew exactly where he stood, despite the quiet. He was drawn to her silence, a silence that spoke volumes. The girl who had been sold like livestock, the girl who had come from nothing, had somehow found a place within this massive house without uttering a word. There was power in that silence, a power Henry had never fully understood. It was as if she were speaking to him in ways words never could. After a long while, Clara slowly turned from the window, her gaze flickering across the room. Her eyes locked with Henry's, and for a brief moment their gazes met silent, unspoken. A quiet understanding passed between them. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It was a look that transcended anything he had expected. It was as if Clara could see him, understand him, without him ever saying a word. She didn't need to ask for anything. She simply existed, and in doing so, she demanded attention. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, finally breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I trust you will find everything to your liking here," he said, his voice gentle but formal. He meant it, though it sounded more like an offer of hospitality than anything else. Yet, deep down, he realized it was more than that. He wasn't just offering her comfort, he was offering her a life, a chance at something different from what she had known. Clara did not respond with words. Instead, she walked to the small desk by the window, her fingers trailing across the surface. She picked up a quill, examined it for a moment, and then dipped it into the inkpot. Henry watched, unsure of what to expect. Would she write something? Would she communicate with him in this way? After a few moments, Clara began to write slowly, her handwriting delicate and precise. When she finished, she turned the parchment toward him. The words were simple, but they struck Henry with unexpected force. "Thank you." Henry was taken aback. She had thanked him, not with words, but with the quiet act of writing. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She had no voice, but she had still found a way to speak. "You're welcome," Henry said quietly, almost to himself. For the first time since he had brought Clara into his home, he felt a glimmer of understanding. She wasn't just silent, she was communicating in her own way, one that didn't rely on sound, but instead on the quiet language of her actions. Henry realized that Clara was more than just a girl in need of charity. She was a person who understood the world in a way he had never considered. And though she didn't speak, her silence was louder than any words could ever be. As Clara continued to settle into her new surroundings, Henry began to pay more attention to the subtle details of her behavior. She had an uncanny ability to sense things without being told, small things, like the faintest changes in the weather or the way the light shifted in the room. One evening, as Henry returned from his study, Clara glanced up from the chair where she had been sitting by the fire. Without a word, she stood and walked to the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. Henry, puzzled by her actions, followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual. A few moments later, the sky darkened and a chill wind began to stir. Clara had known the change was coming long before it arrived. It was then that Henry realized Clara's silence was not just a lack of sound, it was a form of awareness that he couldn't yet grasp. She wasn't deaf. She wasn't mute. Clara heard and understood things that Henry could not even begin to fathom. It was as though she was attuned to a frequency that existed outside the realm of ordinary perception. With each passing day, Clara's mysterious silence became less of a burden and more of an enigma that Henry felt drawn to solve. He couldn't yet understand her completely, but he could see that there was far more to Clara than met the eye. She was not a victim, nor was she the helpless girl her father had described. Clara was something different, something far more complex, something that would change the course of Henry's life in ways he had never imagined. The quiet girl had already begun to speak, but not with words, and Henry, though he could not hear her voice, felt her presence loud and clear. The first days of Clara's time at Ashford Manor were quiet, almost too quiet for Henry's tastes. He had been accustomed to solitude, yes, but this was something different. It wasn't the peaceful kind of solitude he had known before, where the silence was filled only with his own thoughts, but rather a deep, almost suffocating stillness that enveloped the estate. Clara's presence was unmistakable in its quiet, a constant reminder of something unspoken between them. She did not speak, did not ask questions, and did not seek his attention. But somehow, Henry felt her absence of words as profoundly as he would have felt her presence if she had filled the halls with chatter. As the days passed, Henry found himself watching Clara from afar, noting the way she moved through the house. She never hurried, never stumbled in her movements, even though she seemed unfamiliar with the opulence of her new home. Her gestures were always fluid and graceful, as if she had been raised in such an environment, despite her obvious poverty. Yet, it wasn't Clara's movements that held Henry's attention. It was the way she connected with the animals on the estate. His stables housed some of the finest horses in the region, prized for their breeding and lineage. Henry had always prided himself on his ability to handle them. His expertise as a rider and trainer was well known among his peers. But it wasn't long before Clara's interactions with the horses began to intrigue him in a way he had not anticipated. It started small, almost unnoticed at first. Henry would often find Clara in the stables, gently brushing down the horses as they nuzzled her hand, their eyes soft with trust. At first, he assumed it was merely a passive connection, a girl tending to the animals, as he had seen many others do. But one morning, as he watched from a distance, something caught his eye. Clara was standing beside a chestnut mare, her fingers resting lightly on the animal's neck. The horse, usually skittish around new people, seemed remarkably calm, its large eyes unfocused in a way Henry had never seen before. Clara's hand didn't move much, but there was an unmistakable energy between them, something Henry couldn't quite put his finger on. The horse shifted slightly, as if it were responding to something Clara was communicating. Henry was struck by the quiet beauty of the moment, the mare seemingly at ease in Clara's presence. It was as if the animal was reading her, responding to her touch in ways that Henry couldn't understand. Clara didn't speak a word, yet the communication between them was undeniable. He stood there for several moments, watching her interact with the horses. The way they trusted her, the way they moved under her gentle touch, felt both foreign and familiar to him. He had never seen such a deep connection between an animal and a human. Clara didn't need to give commands or use any gestures beyond her soft caress. The horses, it seemed, understood her as much as she understood them. Later that evening, Henry found himself in the stable again. Clara was brushing the mane of the mare she had been with earlier. This time, he approached her, unable to resist the urge to ask questions that had been lingering in his mind. "Clara," he began cautiously, unsure of how to break the silence between them. She turned her head at the sound of his voice, her eyes meeting his briefly before she returned her attention to the mare. Her expression was calm, almost meditative. He took a hesitant step forward. Have you always been so connected with the animals?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace between them. Clara paused for a moment before gently running her fingers along the horse's coat. She did not answer him in words, but instead she placed her hand on the horse's flank, as though to demonstrate her unspoken response. The mare shifted closer, resting its head on her shoulder. Henry watched, fascinated by the way the animal seemed to gravitate toward Clara, drawn in by her touch. Henry found himself at a loss for words. In the silence, Clara had answered him not with speech, but with action, showing him her silent but undeniable bond with the animals. She didn't need words to communicate with them, just as she didn't need them to communicate with him. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Clara wasn't deaf, nor was she mute. She had simply chosen not to speak, to live in a world where sound didn't rule her life. The thought lingered with him as he retreated from the stable, his mind racing. Clara's abilities were unlike anything he had ever encountered. She understood the animals in a way that he, despite his years of experience, couldn't. It was as if she spoke to them in a language without words, one that transcended the need for sound altogether. Over the next few days, Henry's curiosity about Clara only deepened. He noticed her subtle movements, the way she reacted to the world around her, the way she seemed to sense things before they happened. Clara would stand at the window in the mornings, looking out at the sky as if reading the clouds, her gaze steady and thoughtful. The way she responded to the rhythms of nature, like the breeze that shifted just before a storm, or the way the light changed in the evening, struck Henry as extraordinary. It was as if she could feel the world in ways he could not. One afternoon, Henry found himself in the library, reviewing some papers related to the estate's affairs. As he scanned the documents, his eyes kept drifting toward the window, where Clara stood once again, looking out at the horizon. He wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to her, compelled by her silence. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He turned to find Clara standing in the doorway, her eyes locked on him. She wasn't asking for permission to enter, she was simply there, as if she had known he was waiting for her presence. Henry cleared his throat, feeling a sudden rush of discomfort. "Come in," he said, his voice somewhat strained. Clara walked slowly into the room, her steps light and deliberate. She moved toward the window, but she did not speak. Instead, she simply stood beside him, her eyes on the falling rain outside. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather peaceful. It was as if they both understood that there were things that could not be spoken, things that didn't need words to be understood. Henry found his eyes drawn to Clara's face, the way her features remained soft, her expression calm as she watched the storm. He had always been a man of words, a man accustomed to discussing everything: his work, his estate, even the smallest details of his daily life. But Clara, in her silence, had a way of communicating that Henry couldn't put into words. It was a language that spoke not of facts or logic, but of something deeper, something more profound. Without thinking, Henry reached out and placed his hand on the desk in front of him. Clara's gaze flickered toward his hand, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no need for words in that look, just a quiet understanding. It was as though she had known his thoughts before he could even voice them. She had heard his unspoken question, and in her silence, she had given him the answer. Henry took a step back, his heart heavy with realization. Clara was not simply someone who lived in silence. She was someone who had learned to listen in ways that no one else had. She had a deep understanding of the world, of the animals, of the unspoken rhythms that governed everything around her. In the days that followed, Henry began to pay closer attention to Clara. He watched the way she interacted with the horses, how she seemed to intuit their needs, and how the animals responded to her. He observed her in the gardens, where she seemed to move in harmony with the plants, her hands gently brushing the leaves as if she were listening to their quiet whispers. As much as Henry tried to dismiss it, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's silence was not a lack of communication. It was a form of communication in itself. It was a language of its own, one that Henry was only beginning to understand. And as Clara's presence continued to settle into the estate, Henry found himself growing more fascinated by her. There was a mystery in her silence, a mystery that both intrigued and unsettled him. He had never been one to believe in the supernatural or the unexplained, but Clara's connection with the world, her ability to sense things others could not, made him question everything he thought he knew. Her silence, once a barrier between them, was now the thing that drew him closer. It was as if she spoke in a way that transcended words, and Henry, despite his best efforts to maintain his distance, was helplessly drawn into the quiet enigma that was Clara. In the days that followed, Henry found himself not just watching Clara but waiting for the next moment when she would reveal another piece of her mystery, another hidden layer of understanding. And though he had never been one to entertain the idea of fate or destiny, he couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to their meeting, something more than simple chance that had brought her into his life. The late afternoon sky had already begun to darken, the pale blue of the day giving way to ominous clouds that gathered in heavy layers above Ashford Manor. The wind, usually a gentle whisper through the trees, began to stir, pushing the scent of earth and rain toward the house. It was the kind of change in the air that would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by Clara. Inside the manor, Henry sat at his desk in the study, the vast windows on either side of him casting slanted beams of amber light onto the oak floors. The papers before him were a mix of estate business land assessments, tax documents, and requests from neighboring landowners. He had always found solace in this work, in the control it gave him over his surroundings. The numbers, the facts, the black and white certainty of it all, it was familiar, it was manageable. But even in the midst of his routine, a strange sensation tugged at him, an undercurrent of unease that he couldn't quite place. He tried to ignore it, focused instead on the paperwork in front of him, but his eyes kept straying to the windows, to the growing storm clouds on the horizon. At that moment, he heard a soft sound from the doorway. Clara stood in the frame, her eyes wide, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an almost frantic energy. Her gaze was fixed on the darkening sky outside, her posture tense, as though every part of her being was attuned to the change in the weather. Henry didn't immediately respond. He was absorbed in his thoughts, too preoccupied with the matters at hand to give Clara his full attention. He had grown accustomed to her silent presence, to the way she moved through the house with the grace of someone who belonged, even though she rarely spoke. But today, there was something different about her. Clara stepped into the room, walking toward him with a subtle urgency in her step. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side, an unconscious movement that Henry had seen many times, but this time her hands seemed to tremble. She came closer, her eyes never leaving the sky, and then she reached out, gently tugging at the sleeve of his coat. "Clara?" Henry asked, his voice breaking through the silence. He didn't quite understand why she seemed so unsettled. She had been living in the manor for weeks now, and though she had always been a quiet presence, she had adapted to her new life with remarkable ease. Her silence, while always profound, had never seemed to trouble her until now. Clara didn't answer him, but her eyes spoke volumes. She pulled at his sleeve again, more urgently this time, and pointed toward the window, toward the distant hills beyond the estate. Her gaze was filled with deep concern, and Henry felt an unfamiliar unease settle in the pit of his stomach. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softened with uncertainty. "What do you see?" She didn't speak, but the intensity of her gaze only grew. Clara's eyes flickered toward the horizon, and Henry followed her line of sight. The wind had picked up, sending leaves scattering across the estate's grounds. The trees swayed, their branches creaking as the storm began to gather strength. Henry furrowed his brow. "It's just a storm, Clara, nothing to be alarmed about." He turned back to the papers in front of him, dismissing her unease as a simple reaction to the weather. But Clara wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her fingers grasping his sleeve once again, tugging him insistently. Her gaze was unyielding, her eyes wide with an emotion Henry couldn't place: fear, perhaps, or something even deeper. She was trying to tell him something, but for the life of him, Henry couldn't figure out what. Then, without warning, Clara pointed toward the hills once more, her fingers trembling slightly. Her silent plea was unmistakable. She was urging him to look, to see what she saw, and in that moment, Henry felt a surge of unease. Something in her expression told him that this wasn't just a passing storm. Against his better judgment, Henry stood from his desk and moved toward the window, Clara following closely behind. He glanced outside, his eyes scanning the darkening sky. The clouds had thickened rapidly, swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. The wind had grown fiercer, and the air felt charged, as though the very atmosphere was trembling in anticipation. Henry opened the window, the cool wind rushing in as he peered toward the hills. There was nothing to suggest that this was anything more than a typical summer storm, but Clara's insistence had his senses tingling, a subtle warning he couldn't ignore. A low rumble of thunder reached his ears, distant but unmistakable. And then, as if on cue, a sharp crack split the air, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, followed by a deafening crash as it struck a tree on the far edge of the estate. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he turned to Clara, his heart pounding in his chest. She hadn't flinched at the lightning strike. Her expression remained steady, almost as if she had known it was coming. As the storm began to roar in earnest, Clara stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the now burning tree in the distance. "Clara," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the storm. "You knew. You felt it, didn't you?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence, in that moment, spoke more clearly than any words ever could. She had known, long before anyone else had sensed the impending danger, that the storm was coming. Henry stood frozen, watching the fire consume the tree in the distance. The wind howled, and rain began to fall in torrents, drenching the estate in a matter of minutes. But Clara's calm remained unshaken. She had known the storm was coming, not through the sound of the wind or the first raindrops, but through something else, something deeper, a sensation that Henry couldn't begin to comprehend. The realization hit him like a cold wave crashing over him. Clara was not just sensing the world in the way he had imagined. She wasn't simply reacting to the weather or to the sights around her. No, Clara was hearing something beyond the realm of ordinary perception. She was connected to the world in ways that Henry had never considered, in ways that no one else could understand. She was hearing the vibrations of the earth, the subtle shifts in the air, the warning signs that no one else could detect. She had felt the storm's approach long before the first cloud had appeared on the horizon. She had heard it, in her own way, through her touch, through the quiet pulse of the world that most people never noticed. Henry's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The storm, so sudden and violent, had been something Clara had felt coming long before it struck. It was as if she had tapped into a frequency, a hidden pulse that existed beneath the surface of the world, one that Henry couldn't hear, but Clara could. "Clara," Henry murmured, more to himself than to her. "What are you?" But Clara didn't respond. She simply stood beside him, her gaze still fixed on the horizon, where the storm was now in full force. There was no fear in her eyes, only the quiet certainty that she had known this would happen, that she had felt it in her bones long before the first crack of thunder. The wind howled, sending sheets of rain slamming against the windows, but Clara remained still, her presence calm and grounded amidst the chaos. She had warned him, without speaking a single word. She had communicated with him in a way that words could never capture. Henry took a deep breath, his chest tightening with the weight of the realization. Clara had not just seen the storm coming, she had heard it, felt it in ways that were beyond his comprehension. She was not merely a silent girl who had been misunderstood. She was something far more extraordinary, a girl with a gift that he could not yet understand. As the storm raged outside, Henry felt a shift within himself. The unease that had once been a fleeting sensation had now become something more. Clara's silence was not a barrier between them, it was a bridge, one that connected them in ways that transcended sound and speech. For the first time since he had brought Clara into his home, Henry felt something stir within him, something deeper than curiosity, something that went beyond fascination. It was awe, mingled with a deep sense of wonder. Clara was not just a girl who had been sold into his care, she was a mystery, a force of nature that he had yet to fully understand. And as the storm continued to rage outside, Henry knew that this was only the beginning. The answers to the questions that plagued him about Clara's abilities, her silence, and her connection to the world were still out of reach. But he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the man he had been before Clara had entered his life, and whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it with her by his side. The village of Ashford was a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were scarce and gossip was plentiful. It was a town that held on to tradition and resisted change. People lived simple lives, rooted in the land and the rhythms of the seasons, with a deep sense of suspicion toward anything or anyone that disrupted the calm order of their existence. Clara, in her silence, had always been an outsider. Though she had been brought into the Duke's home with a mix of curiosity and pity, it wasn't long before the whispers began. The first rumors were small, barely noticeable. A few of the village women would exchange knowing glances as Clara passed by with the Duke, and others would murmur that the girl was simply strange. But as the days turned into weeks, those quiet mutterings began to grow louder. Clara's connection to the animals on the estate became the focus of suspicion. She seemed to know things before they happened, and the animals responded to her in ways that left the townsfolk uneasy. It was said that she could soothe even the most wild of horses with a single touch, that she could calm the most agitated dogs with nothing but a look. But it was not just her affinity with the animals that sparked fear. It was the strange way she seemed to predict events. When the rain would fall, Clara was always the first to notice, her fingers brushing the sky with an almost prophetic air. She would watch the clouds, her eyes narrowed with concentration, and then turn to Henry, signaling that a storm was coming, long before the first drop of rain had fallen. At first Henry had brushed it off. He had noticed Clara's unusual perception, but he attributed it to her acute senses or perhaps her deep connection with nature. However, the townspeople didn't see it that way. To them, it was more than uncanny, it was unnatural. Some began to call her a witch, others a freak, and still others whispered that she had powers beyond human comprehension. The fear began to spread, slowly at first, like a disease that no one could identify, but it soon became all-consuming. One evening, as Henry sat in the study, he heard the unmistakable sound of a commotion outside the manor. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, pulling back the heavy curtains just enough to peek outside. What he saw made his stomach tighten. A crowd had gathered at the gates of Ashford Manor. At least 20 villagers stood in a tight group, their faces twisted with anger and fear. They were shouting, though Henry could not make out the words. Their voices were a mix of resentment and accusation, and they pounded their fists against the gates in frustration. Henry's heart sank. He had feared this moment, feared that the town's growing unease with Clara would eventually lead to this. He knew how superstitious the people could be, how quick they were to turn on anything that seemed outside of their understanding. And Clara, with her strange gifts, was the perfect target for that fear. He hurried down the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As he reached the front door, the butler, Mr. Gibbons, was already there, his expression grim. "Your Grace, it appears the townsfolk have gathered," Mr. Gibbons said quietly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "They're demanding that Miss Clara be removed from your household." Henry's jaw tightened. "What are they saying?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "They're calling her a witch, my lord, saying she has unnatural powers. They claim she's brought misfortune to the town, that animals have been behaving strangely ever since she arrived." Mr. Gibbons paused, then added, "Some say she's the cause of the crop failures, and others, they say she has cursed the village." Henry's mind raced. He had known that Clara's abilities were extraordinary, but he had never imagined they would be perceived as a curse. They were gifts, gifts that came from a deep, almost otherworldly understanding of the world around her. But to the townsfolk, that understanding was alien, and anything unfamiliar was met with fear. Henry strode to the door, flinging it open to face the mob. His gaze swept over the crowd, men and women, old and young, their faces red with anger, their eyes filled with suspicion. He recognized some of them, but most were strangers, villagers, who had been too quick to judge Clara based on their own superstitions. "I am the Duke of Ashford," he called out, his voice firm and commanding. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" The crowd fell silent for a moment, and then an older man stepped forward. His name was Mr. Withers, a farmer who had lived in the village for many years. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. "Your Grace," Mr. Withers said, his tone bitter, "we come to you with a request. We've heard of the strange things happening at your estate, animals acting out of turn, crops failing, and now the young girl you've taken in. We believe she's responsible for the misfortune that's befallen this village." Henry's chest tightened. "What are you accusing her of?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. "She's a witch," another voice from the crowd cried out, and there were murmurs of agreement from the others. "She's cursed this place, Your Grace. We want her gone." Henry's anger flared. He had heard enough. He stepped forward, his eyes hardening as he faced the crowd. "Clara is no witch," he declared, his voice loud and steady. "She is a young woman with rare gifts, gifts that you cannot begin to understand. She has done nothing but help this estate, and she has brought no harm to anyone." The crowd shifted uneasily, some of them exchanging nervous glances. Henry's words had caught them off guard, but it was clear that the fear had already taken root in their hearts. The town's suspicions were not easily quelled. "She can heal animals," Henry continued, his voice unwavering. "She has an understanding of the world that none of you have, and if you choose to fear her because of it, then I can do nothing to change your minds. But know this, if you threaten her, you threaten me." The crowd murmured, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, there was a tense silence, broken only by the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Henry could feel their anger, their fear, but he could also see the hesitation in their eyes. They were not sure what to make of him, of his defense of Clara, of the bond that had begun to form between them. But then, as if on cue, Mr. Withers spoke again, his voice cold. "She's a danger to this village, Your Grace. We've tolerated her presence long enough. It's time for her to leave." Henry's jaw clenched. He was no stranger to the ways of the world, to the prejudices and fears that often led people to act out of ignorance. But Clara was not like them. She had done nothing wrong, nothing that justified this kind of treatment. She was different, yes, but in a way that should have been celebrated, not condemned. "No," Henry said, his voice firm. "Clara will not leave. She is under my protection, and I will not allow you to chase her from this estate based on fear and superstition." There was a long pause, the tension between Henry and the crowd palpable. For a moment, it seemed as if the mob might escalate their threats, might demand more of him. But then Mr. Withers took a step back. "We'll see how long your protection lasts, Your Grace," he said, his words laced with bitterness. "But mark my words, if this town continues to suffer, we'll not be so kind next time." With that, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs of discontent drifting away like the last remnants of a storm. But Henry stood at the gate, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He watched as the mob melted into the distance, knowing that this was only the beginning. As the last of the villagers left, Henry turned and walked back toward the manor. Clara had been watching from the window, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, but Henry could see the weight of the confrontation in her eyes. She understood the tension, the fear, the rejection that the villagers had thrown her way. He didn't know what the future held for her, for them both. But one thing was certain: he would not let her go. He would not allow the town's fear to dictate her fate. He had made his decision, and now he had to live with the consequences. Clara was no witch. She was more than that, much more. And Henry would protect her, no matter the cost. The village of Ashford had always been a place where the rhythms of life were predictable, and the land, though often temperamental, had been kind to its people. The seasons changed, the crops grew, and the villagers followed the same routines they had for generations. Illnesses came and went, but for the most part, the village was free from the kinds of mysteries that plagued larger cities. But then, one quiet evening, everything changed. The child in question, young Thomas Weaver, had always been healthy. He was a bright-eyed boy, no older than 10, with a wild mop of hair and a mischievous grin that made him popular among the village children. He was always running, always playing, always in motion. But one night, he fell ill with a fever that no one could explain. It started with a small cough and a low fever, but by morning, his condition had worsened. He burned with a high fever, his face flushed and pale at the same time, his tiny body trembling uncontrollably. By the time Thomas's mother had rushed him to the village doctor, Dr. Barnes, his condition had deteriorated further. Dr. Barnes, a man of considerable experience but limited knowledge, could find no clear cause for the boy's ailment. He prescribed some herbs to ease the fever and sent the family home, but when the fever worsened by the hour, the villagers became frantic. As the day stretched on and Thomas's condition showed no sign of improving, whispers began to spread. Some of the villagers said that Clara, the Duke's ward, had a gift, a strange, inexplicable connection with the world that set her apart from the rest. Clara, they said, could heal the sick with just a touch, could understand the rhythm of the earth and the elements in ways that defied logic. Some believed she was a healer, others feared she was a witch. It was this growing reputation, fueled by the town's fear and fascination, that eventually led Thomas's desperate parents to make the decision to visit the Duke's manor, seeking Clara's help. Clara had been in the garden when the weavers arrived, her hands delicately trimming the wildflowers that had bloomed in abundance with the change of the seasons. She didn't expect the weavers to come to her. She had not been told of the boy's illness, nor had she ever been asked to help in such a way. But as soon as Mrs. Weaver's tear-streaked face appeared at the gate, Clara stood still, her senses heightened, a strange, inexplicable understanding rising in her chest. Without a word, Mrs. Weaver, her hands trembling, begged Clara to come to the child. "Please, Miss Clara, you must help him. The doctor's remedies have done no good, and we don't know what else to do." Clara nodded silently, her eyes flashing with the quiet determination Henry had come to know well. She didn't need words to understand the request. She simply walked towards the house, her steps measured, her gaze fixed ahead. Henry, who had been watching from the window, felt his heart tighten as Clara passed by, the weavers following closely behind her. He didn't know what to make of it, but there was something in Clara's silence that spoke volumes. It was as if she knew exactly what was needed, even without being told. "Clara," Henry began, though his words faded as she entered the house without looking back. He stood for a moment, his thoughts conflicted. He had watched Clara help animals with a subtle understanding, but he had never seen her attempt to heal a human before. He wasn't sure if the villagers truly understood what she could do, or if they feared what they didn't understand. But one thing was certain: whatever Clara had done, whatever force lay within her, it was not something easily explained. Inside, Clara approached Thomas's bed with the calm assurance that only she seemed capable of. The boy's mother hovered at the door, wringing her hands in desperation, while Thomas's father stood beside the bed, his face drawn with concern. Clara's eyes softened as she took in the child's condition. He lay in the bed, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths, his skin fevered and flushed. His eyes were half open, glazed with the fever that had ravaged his tiny body. The room smelled of sweat and herbs, the faint scent of lavender and sage hanging in the air. Without a word, Clara placed her hands on the boy's forehead, feeling the heat of his skin beneath her palms. She closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers moving gently across his skin, tracing the lines of his body as if she were searching for something. She could sense the fever in him, the disturbance in his body, the imbalance that no remedy could fix. After a few moments, Clara stood up, walking toward the small cabinet where the healing herbs were kept. She pulled out a mixture of feverfew, lavender, and mint, crushing the leaves in her hands to release their oils. Without a word, she prepared a brew, her fingers moving deftly, her touch instinctive and sure. She placed the cup by the bedside and turned to Thomas's mother. Her eyes met the woman's, and Clara's silent expression spoke volumes. "Trust me, I can help him." With trembling hands, Mrs. Weaver gave Thomas the medicine, watching as Clara gently cupped his face in her hands, whispering something inaudible to the boy. She had no need for spoken words. The connection she shared with the child transcended sound. Clara's touch, her presence, seemed to calm him, the frantic pulse of his fever beginning to settle. Minutes stretched into hours, and Henry, who had remained at the doorway, watched in awe. He had always known Clara was different, but seeing her in this element, the way she worked, the way she moved without hesitation, made him realize just how much he had underestimated her. As the night wore on, Thomas's fever began to subside, his breathing growing steadier with each passing moment. By dawn, the boy's temperature had returned to normal. His skin, once hot and clammy, now felt cool to the touch. He stirred, opening his eyes, and looked up at Clara with an expression of gratitude he couldn't articulate. Mrs. Weaver, her face filled with disbelief, clutched Clara's hands, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "You've saved him, Miss Clara. We don't know how to thank you." Clara simply smiled, her expression serene. She didn't need thanks. The healing was not for her, it was simply what she was meant to do. As the news of Thomas's miraculous recovery spread through the village, Clara's reputation grew exponentially. She became known as the girl who could heal with her hands, the one who could sense the unseen, the one who understood what others could not. Some of the villagers were in awe of her, treating her as though she were a saint. Others, however, began to view her with suspicion. The fear that had once plagued her began to take root more deeply. The villagers' view of Clara shifted from simple curiosity to something far more complex. They couldn't deny her gifts, but they couldn't comprehend them either. Some of the women who had once whispered about her, speculating on her strange ability to calm animals and predict the weather, now looked at her with a mixture of reverence and dread. It was said that she had a connection with the earth, that she could hear the cries of animals before they were born, that she could heal wounds without bandages or potions. But with the awe came the fear. The whispers turned darker, accusing Clara of possessing powers she could not control. There were rumors that she had used magic to cure the boy, that the medicine was only a part of her strange ability. The town's fear was fed by the unknown, by the belief that Clara was not human in the way others were. Still, despite the fear, Henry found himself even more captivated by Clara. He watched her closely, noticing the quiet confidence with which she moved through the estate. She seemed to be a woman of few words but many actions, her ability to heal, to listen without needing to speak, to understand without the need for explanation. She had helped Thomas, but more than that, she had opened Henry's eyes to the depths of her knowledge, a knowledge he could never fully grasp, but that he couldn't deny. Her healing abilities were more than just medical knowledge, they were something deeper, something instinctive. And as the days passed, Henry began to realize that Clara was not just someone with an extraordinary gift, she was someone whose presence had changed the very fabric of his life. The bond between them deepened, not through words, but through silent understanding. As Clara continued to heal, to help, and to grow, Henry found himself drawn to her in ways he could not explain. But in the eyes of the village, Clara would always remain an enigma. She would always be the girl who healed with a touch, who understood with a glance, and who spoke volumes without ever uttering a word. Whether they revered her or feared her, one thing was certain: Clara had become a force that could not be ignored. The sprawling estate of Ashford Manor had always been a fortress, one built not with stone, but with isolation. Henry Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had spent much of his life behind its walls, a solitary figure whose only companions had been the affairs of his lands and the echoes of his own thoughts. It had never bothered him before. He had always found solace in the solitude, in the order and structure that came with the title of Duke. But now, as he sat alone in his study, the silence felt different. Henry had grown accustomed to being alone, to keeping people at arm's length, both physically and emotionally. He had built walls around himself over the years, walls that shielded him from the complexities of the world outside, from the expectations that came with his wealth and status, and most of all, from the vulnerability that came with human connection. It was easier this way, he had told himself. Easier to remain detached, to hide behind the propriety of his title and the formality of his role. But that had all changed since Clara had entered his life. Clara, the girl who didn't speak, who communicated with a silent grace that defied the boundaries of language. She had entered his world like a quiet storm, disrupting the carefully constructed order of his life, and now Henry found himself unable to turn back. It had started so innocently. She had been a charity, a purchase made out of pity, at least that was what he had told himself in the beginning. She had been an enigma, a mystery wrapped in silence, and Henry had assumed that his involvement with her would be nothing more than a passing responsibility, a temporary arrangement. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his study, he realized that the connection between them had grown into something much more profound. Clara had shown him a world he had never known existed, a world where understanding didn't rely on words. She had a way of communicating that transcended language, of seeing him in a way no one ever had. Her silence was not a barrier, but a bridge, one that connected their souls in a way that words could never accomplish. As he reflected on the time that had passed since Clara's arrival, Henry realized just how deeply he had come to care for her. It wasn't because of her beauty, which was undeniable, nor was it because of her status, which was non-existent. It was because of her soul, the quiet depth in her eyes, the way she understood him without speaking, without asking. She saw the parts of him that he had hidden from the world for so long, the parts of him that even he had learned to keep buried. In Clara's silence, Henry had found someone who understood him without judgment, someone who didn't require him to explain himself. He had always thought of himself as a man in control, someone who held power over his own life, his estate, his future. But Clara had cracked that facade. She had shown him the fragility beneath his carefully constructed walls, and in doing so, she had opened a door he had never known existed. A door to a life he had never imagined for himself, a life that was not governed by rules, expectations, or status, but by connection, understanding, and love. And yet, as Henry sat in the dim light of his study, he felt a pang of unease. The walls he had built around himself were still there, still strong, and they were not easily breached. As much as he had come to care for Clara, as much as he had come to admire her strength, her grace, and the quiet power she possessed, he could not shake the reality of their situation. Clara was not of his world. She had no title, no wealth, no position to speak of. She was a mute girl, brought to his home out of charity, her past shrouded in mystery. She was an outsider, someone who did not belong in the world that Henry inhabited, and while he could not deny the connection that had grown between them, he couldn't ignore the truth that lingered in the back of his mind. A relationship between them would be impossible not because of her silence, but because of the world they lived in. The world that would never accept someone like Clara as his equal. The world that demanded social boundaries be respected, that dictated who could be with whom based on birthright, wealth, and status. To love Clara was to risk everything: his reputation, his title, his standing in society, and the consequences of defying those rules were severe. He knew that. He had seen it happen to others before, the way society could turn on a person who dared to step outside its expectations. Henry ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He was a man of duty, a man of tradition. His position as Duke was not just a title, it was a responsibility, one that carried expectations he had never questioned before. And now, as he found himself drawn to Clara, those expectations felt like chains, pulling him in one direction while his heart pulled him in another. The more he thought about it, the more the conflict within him grew. Clara had become an integral part of his life, and yet he felt the pull of his duty to uphold the traditions of his family, to maintain the order of his estate, to protect the legacy that had been entrusted to him. How could he reconcile his feelings for Clara with the weight of his responsibilities? How could he justify a future with her when everything about their connection seemed to fly in the face of the world he had always known? Henry stood up suddenly, pacing across the room as if he could outrun his thoughts. He had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions, to control the course of his life. But now, for the first time in years, he felt completely out of control. Clara had broken down the walls he had spent a lifetime building, and now he was unsure of who he was or what he wanted. He stopped at the window, looking out over the estate. The gardens, the stables, the far-reaching lands, all of it had once seemed like a world of endless possibility. But now, it felt like a cage, a reminder of everything he had sacrificed in the name of duty. Clara had shown him that there was more to life than this, more than titles and wealth and tradition. She had shown him that there was a world beyond the walls of Ashford Manor, a world where connection and love were not bound by rules or expectations. But could he truly embrace that world? Could he, the Duke of Ashford, truly turn his back on everything he had been taught to value in order to build a life with Clara? The thought terrified him, and yet it also thrilled him in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in his life, he found himself questioning the very foundations of his existence. Was the life he had built for himself the life he truly wanted? Or had he simply been going through the motions, living according to the rules of a world that no longer seemed to fit? As he stood at the window, Henry knew that he could no longer ignore the truth that had been quietly growing within him. He cared for Clara. He cared for her in a way that went beyond mere affection, beyond the connection they shared in silence. He had come to love her not for her silence, but for the way she had opened his eyes to a world he had long closed off. And yet, the question remained. Could he love her in a world that would never accept their love? Could he stand by her, knowing that their bond, so pure and real, was forbidden by the very society that had once been his greatest ally? Henry's heart was torn, caught between two worlds, the world of duty and tradition, and the world Clara had shown him, a world where understanding transcended words, and love transcended status. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the manor in shadow, Henry realized that he could no longer live in silence. He could no longer hide behind the walls he had built. The choice before him was clear. He could either remain within the confines of the world he knew, or he could step into the unknown, into a world where love, not status, would guide him. But one thing was certain. Clara had already changed him, and no matter what he decided, there would be no going back. The Duke of Ashford's life, once marked by certainty and control, had now become a journey of self-discovery, a journey that would lead him to a place he could never have imagined. The days had blurred together, each one slipping into the next with little distinction. Henry had found himself caught in a quiet whirlwind ever since Clara had come into his life. Their unspoken connection had grown deeper, yet the silence between them remained. It was a silence that had become a language of its own, one that transcended words, one that Henry had come to understand in ways he never expected. Clara's quiet presence had become a constant in his life, and though she never spoke, Henry knew that she communicated more profoundly than anyone he had ever known. Yet, despite the bond they shared, Henry still felt the weight of their silence. He longed for her to speak, for her to reveal more of herself, to share the thoughts and feelings that were locked away behind her eyes. He had watched her, tried to understand her, but there were times when her silence felt like a barrier that kept him from truly knowing her, from truly reaching her. Clara never asked for anything, never demanded his attention, but Henry found himself constantly drawn to her. He had come to care for her not just for the way she had saved him from the loneliness he had carried for so long, but for the quiet strength she carried within her. Clara had shown him a world where words were not necessary, a world where understanding could pass between people without a single sound. It was one evening, after dinner, when the moment of truth finally arrived. The sun had set, casting the estate in shadows, and the air outside had turned cool with the promise of an autumn chill. Henry sat in the drawing room, a book in his hands, though his attention was elsewhere. His gaze drifted to the window, where Clara stood as she often did, looking out at the sprawling gardens. He had come to learn that she enjoyed the quiet of the evening, the peace that settled over the land as the world slipped into night. Clara had always been a quiet observer, but tonight there was something different about her. She stood at the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill, her posture unusually tense. There was an air of quiet anticipation around her, as if something was about to happen, something that had been waiting to be revealed. Henry set the book down, his heart racing with an unfamiliar urgency. For the first time in months, he felt the urge to speak to her, not just to observe her, but to ask the questions that had been building in his mind. He rose from his seat and approached her, his footsteps soft on the floor, the only sound in the room. "Clara?" His voice was gentle, barely above a whisper, as though he feared disturbing the fragile moment that hung between them. Clara turned her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no uncertainty. Her eyes were steady, calm, but there was something more, something deeper that Henry couldn't quite place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was a silence that felt different from the ones that had come before. It was as if they were both waiting for what neither of them knew. Then, in the quiet of the room, Clara opened her mouth. "I can hear your heart." The words were soft, tentative, as if they had been waiting a lifetime to escape her lips. Her voice was not loud, nor was it commanding. It was a whisper, a fragile sound that seemed to hang in the air, trembling with meaning. The simplicity of the sentence, its quiet profundity, struck Henry to his core. For a moment, he could not breathe. He could not think. His mind raced to catch up with what he had just heard. Clara had spoken. She had finally spoken, but it wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't a confession of love or an explanation of her silence. It was something deeper, something more intimate. She had told him that she could hear his heart. In that moment, everything changed. Henry had always believed that their connection was one of silence, but he had never understood it fully. He had come to care for Clara, to love her in ways he could not explain, but he had never realized how much she truly understood him. Clara's silence was not a void, it was a language, one that he had been learning to speak without even realizing it. Her ability to hear his heart, to understand his unspoken emotions, revealed a depth to their connection that he had never anticipated. I don't understand," Henry whispered, his voice shaking with the weight of his emotions. How can you hear my heart?" Clara's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him, her movements graceful and deliberate. She did not answer him with words, but with the same silent understanding that had always existed between them. Her fingers, warm and steady, reached out and rested on his chest, just over his heart. She didn't need to explain further. In that simple gesture, Henry understood. Clara had always heard him not with her ears, but with her soul. She had always understood his pain, his sorrow, his joy, even when he had never spoken of it. She had known him in ways that no one else had, in ways that went beyond words. Henry felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at Clara. In that moment, he realized that their bond was not just one of compassion or affection. It was a connection that went beyond the limitations of language, a connection that transcended sound and silence. Clara had been listening to him all along, his heart, his unspoken desires, the parts of him he had kept hidden for so long. She had heard him in a way that no one else had. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly as he touched her wrist, where her hand still rested over his heart. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the steady rhythm of her pulse beneath her fingers. "You've always heard me," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "even when I couldn't hear myself." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable but full of quiet understanding. There was no need for further words, no need for explanations. In that moment, they both knew the truth. Their connection was not just one of shared space or silent companionship. It was one of deep, unspoken understanding. Clara had heard him when no one else had, when he had hidden himself behind walls of his own making. She had seen through the facade he had built, and she had known him in ways he had never allowed anyone else to. The silence between them deepened, but this time it was not oppressive. It was full, rich with meaning, like the space between two notes in a song, a pause that made the music more powerful. Henry's heart beat louder in his chest, not from fear or anxiety, but from the realization that the love he had come to feel for Clara was not just a fleeting affection. It was something deeper, something far more permanent. He had never believed in love at first sight, but now he understood that love could take many forms. It could grow in silence. It could be communicated in ways that went beyond words. Clara had shown him a new way of being, a way of loving that wasn't bound by the constraints of society or expectations. She had taught him that understanding didn't need to be verbalized. It could be felt, experienced, shared without a single word. Henry looked into Clara's eyes, his mind racing with the implications of her words. They were no longer just two people living under the same roof, passing in silence. They were something more, something he could not explain, but something he could no longer ignore. "I don't know what to say," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know that I care for you, Clara, more than I ever thought I could." Clara's eyes softened further, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She didn't need to say anything in return. Her smile was enough. It was a smile that spoke of understanding, of shared experience, of a love that had been built not on words, but on something much deeper, something that Henry had never thought possible. For the first time in his life, Henry felt seen, truly seen, not just by Clara, but by the world she had opened his eyes to. He had spent years hiding behind his title, his estate, his duties. He had built walls to keep himself safe from the vulnerability of human connection. But Clara had broken through those walls with nothing but her silence, her touch, and her ability to understand him in ways he had never imagined. As they stood there, the quiet of the night surrounding them, Henry knew that his life would never be the same. The walls he had built around himself had crumbled, and in their place was something far more profound, a love that needed no words, a connection that transcended everything he had once held dear. And in that moment, as Clara's hand rested over his heart, Henry realized that his heart, too, had found its place. It had found its home, not in the grand halls of Ashford Manor or in the titles he carried, but in the quiet, unspoken bond that he shared with the girl who had always heard his heart. The silence between them was no longer a barrier. It was the language of their love, deep, quiet, and unwavering. And in that silence, they had found everything they needed. Time moved in its gentle rhythm at Ashford Manor, and with it, the world outside shifted as well. Clara, once the subject of whispered rumors and suspicion, had become an integral part of the life Henry had always known, yet in a way that defied all expectations. No longer was she the girl who had been bought out of pity. No longer was she the strange, silent girl from the village. Clara had woven herself into the fabric of Henry's world, not as a guest or a curiosity, but as someone whose presence was now as natural as the turning of the seasons. The townsfolk, once so fearful and judgmental, had slowly come to accept Clara for who she was. The whispers had died down over time, replaced by quiet admiration from some and reluctant acceptance from others. The fear that had once surrounded her had transformed into something more respectful, a recognition of the gifts she offered rather than a suspicion of them. In time, Clara was seen for what she truly was, a healer, a woman of quiet strength, and a force of nature in a world that had often misunderstood her. It had been months since that fateful moment when Clara had spoken for the first time, and in those months the bond between her and Henry had only deepened. Their love was not the kind of love that filled the air with grand declarations or passionate exchanges. It was a love that grew quietly, in the spaces between words, in the shared glances, and the understanding that passed between them without the need for sound. It was the kind of love that, when given the room to grow, had the power to change everything. Clara had not only healed the bodies of the village's sick, she had healed something within Henry as well. She had healed the wounds of his loneliness, the scars that had shaped him into a man who believed he could live without connection. She had shown him a new way of being, one that didn't rely on the things he had once held dear: wealth, status, and reputation. With Clara, he had learned that the most important connections were those that could not be seen or measured. They were the quiet, unspoken bonds that held people together, even when the world around them was chaotic and uncertain. And so, as they stood together on the veranda of Ashford Manor, watching the sun dip low behind the hills, Henry felt a peace he had never known before. The estate, once a symbol of his isolation, had become a home in the truest sense of the word. With Clara by his side, the vastness of the land no longer felt empty. It felt full, rich with meaning, and the promise of a future that was theirs to shape together. Clara stood beside him, her presence as quiet and calming as ever. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, her face peaceful and serene. Henry often found himself lost in the depths of her gaze, as though she could see more than he ever could. She had an understanding of the world that went beyond his own, a wisdom that came not from books or titles, but from the silence she had lived in for so long. The first time Henry had kissed her, it had been a tentative, almost hesitant gesture. He had wondered, even then, if it was enough a simple kiss to show her how much she meant to him, how much he had come to care for her. But since then, there had been no need for words. No need to declare their love for one another, because it was already understood. Their bond spoke louder than any spoken vow could ever do. As time passed, Henry and Clara's life settled into a gentle rhythm. Clara had become an essential part of the daily workings of Ashford Manor. She spent her days tending to the animals, working alongside the stable hands, and caring for the sick who came from the village. She had built a small space in the garden where she could cultivate the herbs she used for her healing remedies, and Henry often found her there, her fingers moving gracefully through the plants as she gathered the ingredients for her potions. Though Henry still had duties as the Duke, he found himself spending more and more time with Clara. He would join her in the garden or sit with her by the hearth, their conversations quiet and easy. There were no grand gestures, no need for pretensions. Their lives were filled with the simple pleasures that came with sharing time in each other's company, working together, talking, and simply being present. One of the greatest gifts Clara had given him was the ability to be present in the moment, to stop looking ahead at the next responsibility or the next task, and simply be. She had taught him to listen, not just to the world around them, but to the silence between them. And in that silence, they had found a depth of connection that neither of them had known was possible. For Clara, the village had become a place where she was no longer an outsider. Her healing had earned her the trust of many, and while there were still a few who whispered about her, the majority of the townsfolk now saw her as a valuable member of their community. She had become a quiet protector, one who understood the world in a way they could not. The animals no longer feared her, and neither did the people. When a child fell ill, it was Clara they called upon, and when an animal was injured, it was Clara who tended to its wounds with a gentleness that made them trust her completely. Despite the acceptance she had gained, Clara never sought recognition for what she did. She did not desire the adoration of the village. She was content with the simple satisfaction of helping others. For Clara, the act of healing was not about accolades, it was about connection, about offering something of herself to the world in a way that didn't require anything in return. She had learned, through her years of silence, that the truest form of communication came not from words, but from the quiet acts of care that passed between people, the moments when their hearts touched without the need for sound. But it wasn't just the village that had accepted Clara. Henry had too. His heart, which had once been closed off from the world, had opened to her in a way that had surprised him. He had once thought that he could live without love, without companionship, but Clara had shown him a different way. She had become his confidant, his partner, the person who understood him more deeply than anyone else ever could. Their connection was not one built on social expectations or titles. It was built on something far more enduring, something that could not be broken by the weight of tradition or the judgment of others. And now, as they stood together, Henry realized that the life they had built was more than he had ever dreamed of. There were no grand celebrations, no declarations of love in front of a crowd. Their love was not a spectacle, it was something quiet, something deep, and something that, despite all the odds, had lasted. "Do you ever think about the future?" Henry asked softly, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the setting sun. Clara turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. She smiled, her expression serene and knowing. In her gaze, Henry saw not just the woman she had become, but the quiet wisdom that had guided her through the years of silence. She did not speak, but her hand found his, her fingers curling around his palm in the simplest of gestures. And in that touch, in the silence that followed, Henry knew the answer. Their future was not something that could be predicted, nor something that could be measured in terms of titles or status. It was a future built on trust, on understanding, on the love they shared in the spaces between words. The town, once divided by fear and suspicion, had come to see Clara for who she truly was, a woman who had the rare gift of listening, of healing, and of understanding. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Together, Henry and Clara built a life that was meaningful, not because it adhered to the expectations of society, but because it was a life that was uniquely their own. A life where the deepest connections were forged in silence, and where love was not defined by words, but by the understanding they shared. And as the days passed, the sun setting over the hills, Henry and Clara knew that the quiet, unspoken bond between them would last forever. It was a love that spoke volumes, and in that silence, they had found their home. If you enjoyed this story of love, understanding, and the quiet bond between two souls, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Share this video with someone who believes that sometimes the deepest connections are the ones that don't need words. And remember, true love speaks in silence. See you in the next video.